We're really excited for today's episode of our first Career Day episode for the Thing About School podcast. And our first guest is Les Harris, who is actually a member of our advisory board for the school. And he is an LCSW. And so we're really excited to chat with him today about the ins and outs of social work and his career. And so welcome to the podcast, Les.
Yeah, happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Good to have you.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So just to get started with, do you want to go ahead and kind of give us an introduction about your background, what it is that you do?
Well, as Angela mentioned, I'm a licensed clinical social worker. And most people don't necessarily always understand what that means. There's several levels of social work that people can pursue. The clinical part of social work allows an individual to actually do psychotherapy, and much like you might consider a psychologist or psychiatrist doing. So I do regular sessions with individuals, groups, families to help with the mental health needs that they might be struggling with. And so that's I've been doing it for 32 years, I guess. And so I guess I'm getting good at it.
Have you always been in like the same capacity of what you're doing now for those 32 years, or has it shifted?
I started my career. I graduated with my bachelor's degree in actually social science and started in a child protection agency the first 9 years of my career. But while I was there is when I began to earn my master's degree that allowed me to pursue the clinical component that I now have. So in the process of working through that, the early part of my career, I was able to attain my LCSW and really essentially open my own practice and see individuals, as I said, families, groups, and for the purpose of psychotherapy.
Awesome. And so in that line of work, what does a typical day in the life of an LCSW look like?
Well, one of the ways that I've always looked at my career is it has allowed me the flexibility to more or less set my own schedule. So essentially, I would look at an average day from 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. and say, hey, there are individuals who would like an appointment to come and visit with me. They would come to my private office and sit on my little couch. And I laugh because I do, as stereotypically, as you might expect, have a couch in my office. And I've been doing this, again, at least in that capacity, over 20 years. And nobody has ever laid on the couch yet. One of the things you always see in modern media and in movies is that when somebody goes to see a psychiatrist or a therapist, that the person lays on a couch to talk about their lives. So that's probably not really reality, but people do come in, sit on the couch, and we identify problems and then hopefully work together to come up with solutions. And so it's a matter of scheduling, which is, hey, what time can you come in a particular day? I schedule my day out accordingly. And there are days when you might have a few appointments. There might be days where I'm here till 8 or 9 o'clock at night, depending on the need. And so that's a typical day.
Okay.
Is it wrong to like picture the Bob Newhart Show?
Yes. Yeah, that's one of my favorite, where he takes 5 minutes and just tells the stop it therapy, and somebody who identifies their problem, and then he says, I just have a couple of words for you, stop it. And boy, it'd be great if it were that easy and I'd get paid for it. Wow.
Well, right? I was thinking about what about Bob as well? He's the typical lay on the couch and get the help and all of that. So
yeah, and interestingly enough, I've had an individual in so many ways similar to that, and although I didn't get the complete stalking component, I did. Good. There was a high level patient that I was seeing, and as I was leaving to do with various vacations and different things, they wanted really some detailed information about where I was going to be, what I was going to be back, what I was going to be doing. And it struck me, wow, I got to be very limited on what I tell this person, because you never know. It doesn't show up in, wherever I'm at. And
that's true.
All of a sudden demand a session.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, and that brings up another aspect of like most traditional career fields where there's that level of professionalism and boundaries within clients. And obviously as a therapist, you would have HIPAA regulations as well, where you can't disclose all of that information. And so did you have to get like specific training in that area, or is that just kind of encompassed within your career degree?
Yeah, that as you go through the clinical component, yeah, so it does require, as you probably know, a master's degree in social work. MSW is the program. And once upon graduation, and you go through 2 years of supervised clinical support, supervision. And that's much like a doctor that would do a residency, for example. After they graduate, they have to be under the supervision of somebody who's already licensed and capable of doing performing the profession. So after graduation, that 2 years, and then you're qualified to be an independent contractor or provider and do what you need to do. You can connect with agencies, you can do private, individual stuff. So it just depends on what you want to do, but it does require an additional 2 years of college, an additional 2 years of essentially residency before you can actually do that social work, clinical social work unsupervised.
Yeah, that makes sense. And then as you're in your career, are there additional trainings or certifications that you have to earn? Like I know some fields require like continuing education units where you have to kind of maintain a license or have additional educational things as well.
Yeah, so every 2 years we have to renew our license, and part of that renewal is 40 hours of CEUs. So those have to be certified CEUs. You just can't go read a book or watch a video. You have to go to a seminar, a conference, a training that is actually certified by the National Association of Social Work to provide those continuing education hours. So there are times when you might get, I could get 30 in a year and 10 the next, or it doesn't matter as long as it adds up to 40 within that 2-year period.
Nice. That's good to know.
But to answer your question about, just the HIPAA, the regulation, that's part of, I think, the residency stuff. You understand and recognize that because it's a healthcare field, those HIPAA requirements are part of it. You learn those early, and you understand very early about confidentiality and not sharing information outside of the clinical atmosphere. And so I think people don't always understand that there's only 2 limits to confidentiality. One is suicidality, and the other one is child abuse. And that's the only time a therapist is allowed to break confidentiality. I sometimes joke around, and maybe it's a little bit morbid, but somebody could come in and to a therapy session and say, 5 years ago, I killed my aunt, and heaven forbid that anyone would ever report that. But the truth is, that is still something that cannot be reported to law enforcement simply because it's part of a disclosure within a therapeutic setting. Now, but the interesting part of that is if they came in and said, when I leave this session today, I'm going to go kill my aunt, I have to call that aunt and warn her that he's about to do that. So it's an interesting rule around confidentiality, but that's what you learn, and that's how. And I've made it a point throughout my career to make sure that people understand that nothing gets outside of that room, because they have to have that trust in that setting.
Definitely.
I'm thinking, like, my mind is thinking, how does somebody separate that? Because you're taking in a lot of information from people, from clients, and a lot of problems. Like, how do you keep that separated and not internalize that personally?
Well, that's why there is a significant amount, and I don't know the statistics, but certainly a number of therapists who get burnt out for that reason. And there is a phenomenon known as secondary trauma, where the caregiver begins over time to assume the trauma of the people they're working with. And so you do have to go through a process of making sure that you're not you have to compartmentalize the difference between your reality and the client's reality. But that mostly requires that the individual is good at self-care. So when you leave your office, then you have an exercise routine, a relaxation routine, a way to more or less divert attention away from the trauma that you're experiencing every day. And I've been good at that. I think that's allowed me to be as successful as I have, is that I'm good at self-care. So I think that's
Yeah.
one of the things that's helped me the most.
Yeah.
Is it what you thought it would be? Like looking back when you first started in the career path, what you pictured it would be and what the reality is, how far off are those?
Well, when I first started, as I mentioned, I started off in child welfare, and that was completely different than I anticipated. Not completely, I shouldn't say it that way, but certainly much different than I thought it would be. And the way that child protective services worked, and placing children in foster care, and some of the limitations to that, and the idea that there are children who are at risk that remain in their homes versus what qualifies for a child to be removed from their home. And it's one of those fields where there's really not a clear set of guidelines, if you will, about what constitutes child abuse to the extent that they need to be out of that environment. And so it was left up to the judgment of, and if you think about it, I'm right out of college. I just graduated. I'm coming into an organization that has a lot of rules and regulation. It's a big bureaucracy, and I'm supposed to make judgments about risk to children. And there really wasn't a lot of clear expectations about that. Where's the line? What line has to be crossed? And so you could do all the assessment tools and everything you needed, but there were still times that did you make the right decision? And there was certainly a lot of ambiguity about that. Plus, every individual would judge that and see that differently. And therefore, you would get a lot of inconsistencies. One person might leave a child home, another one could have removed them. And so it was a lot different than I anticipated, which really essentially was the motivator for going on and getting that clinical aspect, because then it allowed me to intervene in a way that allowed me to identify problems and then work together to solve those problems. And I felt like that was the direction I always wanted to go. I always knew from the very beginning, from the time I started college, that I wanted to be in a helping profession. And it was funny because I started off with, I wanted to be a physical therapist. When I first jumped in, that's my goal. And then I realized that anatomy and physiology and chemistry were really hard subjects for me. So I wasn't great at science in that respect. And so I had to reevaluate and rethink my goals, but I'm still in that helping profession. And so I think I started off with the right motivation, and it just, the college experience allowed me to really refine that to what fit me. And ultimately, in looking back, I made a great choice. I don't know that physical therapy would have been a great career for me. Looking back, I see, man, it just needed to happen the way it did so that I could get into a field where I felt like I could help people.
That's awesome. And so as you were saying that, it kind of got me thinking about, you mentioned, well, science, anatomy, physiology, that wasn't my forte. So as far as the education aspect of getting your bachelor's degree and then your master's degree, what are some of those like hard skills and subjects that you really kind of have to be good at, or, be able to focus your energy on to achieve those degrees?
Well, and it really goes back to high school in a sense. I did not do well in high school, not because I'm unintelligent. It's simply because I just kind of goofed around, didn't take it seriously. And the funny thing is, I always knew I wanted to go to college, but high school was just kind of, whatever, I'll get this done and then go to college. And so when I went to college for the first time, I realized I wasn't good at studying. I didn't have skills and knowledge necessary to really jump into those topics like I needed to. So the first couple of semesters were very difficult for me because I didn't have the study skills. I just didn't have the foundation of knowledge necessary to really get to that level. So I struggled through those first semesters. But once I hit my stride, I started to figure it out and how it worked, and did very well. I was a very good student over the course of my college career. But having said that, I wish I could have seen the future and said, man, if I were better prepared when I first started college, I probably could have cut off a semester or two of how long it took me to get through the process, because it was hard. And I feel like even some of the younger people I work with need, if they could understand that concept, because I hear it time and again. When am I ever going to use math again? What does this even, why does history matter? I'm never going to, I hear that over and over again from these young students. And I'll tell you, it's hard to help convince them that if you get this foundation now, everything else that comes after is a lot easier. And I wish I could somehow shout that from the rooftops a little bit.
Convey that. Yeah. Well, and that's actually funny you say that, because that's part of the reason why we wanted to start the podcast, is to, help kids see why those foundational skills are necessary. Even though, I'm never going to use math again, or I don't like history, why do I need to know this? The skills that you can learn in those courses are invaluable to then, like you said, just apply later, so that you're that much further ahead when you are ready to look at the rest of your life and what you want to do with the rest of your life.
Yeah, and a great example. This happened to be, I'm in college. I went to Boise State, for example, and as a college student, I of course had a part-time job to try to survive and get through the process, and I was working at a sheet metal factory and just kind of sweeping the shop floor and organizing tools and metal for the welders and the engineers, and suddenly, after about 3 or 4 months of doing that, the owner came in and asked me if I wanted to come and help him bid jobs. And I don't know much about how that works. He said, no, that's okay. You're a good worker. I'm going to train you. I'm going to help you figure out how to do this, and because I need a lot of help. And the first thing I recognized is I have to be good at geometry, right? And so one of the things, fortunately, I felt like I had at least good enough math skills that the geometry did come pretty easy. And all of a sudden, here's a person who never thought that math would be a big deal. All of a sudden, I'm thrust into a profession where that's all I'm doing all day is figuring out angles and areas and triangles and circles and domes and spheres, all the things you're supposed to pay attention to in high school that I probably should have paid more attention to. But it was math, and I used it and I needed it, not knowing that I ever would. And that's an example of why I think it's so critical that we learn those skills early.
Yeah, that's a great story. Perfect example of, because you never know what opportunities are going to come your way either, in those moments of, hey, I got hired for this job, but my employer sees the potential here. So you might be thrust into those situations where, you're not you don't feel as prepared because you're thinking, oh, I'll never use this again. Right.
Yeah. And I think what we worry about is sometimes that, my high school career and everything is potentially going to be a predictor for future success or failure. And while there's probably some truth to that, I think that it's about learning and just becoming well-rounded and just being excited about learning it. And people often ask me the question, what is education really? What does it entail? And for some people, that might be a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, a doctorate degree, and that means I'm educated. And that can be part of education. But for me, education is more of a journey where I start at one place and I will eventually end at another. And so you should never lose the insight, the yearning for knowledge that I continually learn. And I've been, as I mentioned, over the course of my career, I've been doing this a long time, and I still learn new things. I'm still excited to hear about some research and whatever would help contribute to me becoming better at my profession.
Yeah.
It's constant. Education is not a place that you arrive at. It is a lifelong journey. And I think if we could capture that in our students and people going through the high school process, then just becoming a little bit more excited about knowledge in general, we would probably do better later on, right?
Yeah,
I love that.
society in general. Yeah, 100%. I love that statement because it's so true. That's, like you said, it's a journey. You're always learning. It never stops.
Yeah, and I think being able to provide context to what you're learning in school is huge, because if a student doesn't see how this will ever relate to what they might do in the future,
Mhm.
it's understandable on why they don't want to put any effort right into their studies. So
Yeah,
I love all those things that you said. And I even think, like, not in addition to the subject matter, just the things you learn being in school, like communicating and problem
right,
solving, critical thinking, those soft skills that we use every single day of our lives
right.
in our
Yeah.
career after high school.
Yeah. Well, that and like you said, the attitude of that lifelong learning is if you can develop this attitude of excitement for learning, even though it's maybe math or science or a subject you don't necessarily want to learn, getting that drive and that desire for learning can then impact your life for hobbies and other things,
Yeah,
your own interests that you want to learn, and then give you that drive to continually improve as an adult throughout your entire life instead of just, well, I give up, I'm not good at it, right? You can get those skills to then try something new, take risks, and be the person that you ultimately want to be.
right. And one of the things that, and it's very difficult, by the way, to talk to youth about child development and it's how critical it is while their brain is still very adaptable and malleable to why those opportunities during adolescence are so critical. Because when they're young children, they have to rely almost exclusively on the parent or the caregiver to make sure that their language development and their concrete operational thinking and all those concepts that are reinforced as a solid foundation during preteen years to ensure that by the time they become an adolescent, they are now more capable of abstract thought, problem solving, and logic, reason, and things of that nature. And what gets missed is when we get them in algebra, when we put them in history and other subjects that they don't necessarily believe are important, what it's doing is focusing that energy on their cognitive development related directly to how well they will do with abstract thought and formal operational thinking and causality and all the things that go along with that thinking part of the brain that is now being reinforced through learning during adolescence. If opportunities are missed during adolescence, they may not ever be restored in adulthood, right? I mean, doesn't mean people will be unintelligent. It just means my ability to think in very abstract terms and problem solve and think things through, be reasonable and realistic, can be impaired later in life.
Yeah, so it just becomes that much harder for them in adulthood because they haven't learned those skills.
Right. So
They-
when any student tells me, I'm never going to use history, I don't know why social science is important or math or whatever, it's hard. And they don't, as soon as they feel like they're being lectured to, which I don't do, but I talk about how critical it will be eventually for them to use their brain in those abstract problem solving, reasoning sort of ways. And while it doesn't seem reasonable right now, guess what? This is helping your brain get better at doing the skills you'll need later in life. And so history is, maybe you're not interested in history, but history is still important because it allows your brain to develop in ways that will help you be successful later.
Yeah, I love that. And it reminds me of the concept of, natural consequences, that if you don't learn this now, you're going to pay for it later.
Right.
And so how does that concept, does it resonate with the youth that you help, or how do you frame it to where they can maybe understand that the importance of natural consequences?
Well, and that's a difficult one. And you have to remember that when we're talking about the population of youth that I'm working with, we talk about, and I would say exclusively for every youth that I'm involved with, they've had a mild to very dramatic childhood adversity, and beginning often at birth and leading clear into adolescence, where their brain has essentially been programmed to survive, not think. And that's a difficult one for any of us to even remember, is we begin to, as adults, we begin to apply this idea or this concept that they should be able to think about, if A equals B and B equals C, then I can start to make a logical connection about that equation. But they're, because of childhood adversity, and they're stuck in their lower part of the brain, which is the survival part. Their only job is to get through the day without being threatened or harmed in some way, even though there isn't a legitimate risk. The brain doesn't know the difference because it's so hypersensitive to threat based on those childhood adversities. And so we start talking about child abuse, sexual abuse, parents who are absentee or unavailable during childhood, parents who use drugs, parents who are suffering from mental illness themselves. And so that childhood adversity, we talk about domestic violence and multiple divorces and all kinds of things where children are not given developmental opportunities which would allow them to integrate into the thinking part of the brain more effectively. So when you ask that question, how do you convince somebody in a sense to understand how learning now will impact their life later on? I can't even begin to answer that in a sense, because my focus is on how do I help you understand that you're a child interested in surviving this moment and getting through the day, and that learning isn't getting to the learning center of the brain unless you learn how to regulate your emotions and recognize the impact of that adversity, and learning those grounding skills and mindfulness skills that will allow them to integrate into their, I call it the upper brain, the cognitive or thinking part of the brain. If their information is stuck in the lower part of the brain, it's not reaching the centers of the brain that's necessary. So my focus is on emotional regulation, helping the child feel safe. And that's not just me. I'm emphasizing that teachers and any other caregivers involved in that person's life have to create safety and security for this child in order for them to learn. And that's ultimately my goal, is to get them to that place where the information is reaching the learning centers of the brain, and then seeing them graduate from high school. And many of them will, I'm telling you, we're going to get 70 or 80 graduates. By the way, just as a sidebar, I'm associated with the alternative high school here in my town, which allows me to work with these students with such high levels of adversity. And so when we get 70 or 80 of them that graduate in the fall, it was never easy for any one of them. To get to that place where they can actually earn that diploma was going to be infinitely harder than an average child in an average high school setting, simply because of adversity. And so to see them finally get to that place is really a huge victory, because they have had to work through things that just your average student would never have to face and confront. So they do learn, they do graduate, but it's a difficult road for many of them, most of them.
You're starting at the bottom of that hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
The Maslow's.
You start talking about Maslow's and hierarchy of needs, and that's a good place to start. If my energy is focused on getting through the day, I don't care about joining the chess club at high school, or being affiliated with a sports team, or going to to dances. I mean, think about that. Their only focus, every amount of energy is how do I survive today? And
Right, right.
that's tough.
That is tough. Yeah. Well, and that's, yeah, that's a lot for anybody to take in, right? And
Yeah.
so, and I mean, we're also in the line of work where we help kids who a lot of times are in residential programs for, some of those same things, mental health, different things like that. And so it is a great victory, like you said, to see them graduate high school, because it is a journey, it is a road. And so I think based on what you were saying is it's, really comes down to that emotional regulation and kind of helping them develop the skills for that self-care, for that meditation, the mindfulness, so that they can start doing that to kind of help regulate those emotions, and then maybe build their confidence up to the point where maybe now I can start focusing a little bit on school, and maybe
Right.
now I can start thinking about my future, and oh, I'm interested in this, let's maybe explore this as a career option.
Right.
And yeah,
One
and
one
so
one interesting thing that I've seen too is students who go through some of our residential programs decide they want to stay in that field. They want to continue helping people. They've learned all
Oh,
these skills. They're doing DBT. They're doing different techniques with their therapists, and they're like, "Hey, this is actually interesting to me." So I don't know if you've experienced that with any of your clients. Have, if they're interested in doing a similar line of work that you're doing. So I guess my question would be, what advice would you give to those students? How would you guide them?
well, and so I learned a very important concept, and there's a person, a researcher who named Dr. Perry, Dr. Bruce Perry, and he is one of the leading researchers on the impact of adversity on childhood development and the impact of trauma on the brain. But one of the things that he focused on was this concept that children will respond to caregivers if they can feel safe with that caregiver, and 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 whether that's a therapist or a teacher, it could be one caring adult that really can make a difference for many of these children. And so here they are now in a therapeutic setting, actually seeing the benefit of of that interaction, and how I feel and how I'm feeling better as a result of that. So that does draw them towards that field. And so what Dr. Perry talked about is this concept or idea that we're turning post-traumatic stress into post-traumatic wisdom for some of these kids and even adults. Is let's figure out a way, and while working together, to instead of focusing on the past trauma, even though that's always there, it's always a component, it's part of their narrative. That's not going away. We just don't forget trauma, but how can we learn from that experience, and instead of experiencing stress symptoms, how can I turn that into wisdom or insight to help not only myself, but potentially other people? And I think that's what drives so many of them to do exactly what you described, Sarah, which is, man, I'm seeing the benefit of this. I'm interested in helping other people. And that comes from a place where I get it. I understand what it's like for somebody to suffer, to struggle, to feel unsafe, to be rejected by a parent, whatever. I get it. I've been through it. I've lived it. Now I've seen the benefit for me. Now I want to help other people. So yes, it's not uncommon to see many of the people that, and particularly youth, who are saying, "Man, I want to be a therapist. I want to be a counselor. I want to go get into this field."
Mm-hmm.
And so I really I try to stay away from, well, here's what you got to, here's a list of
yeah,
things that
Sure.
you need to do to get to college. So the first step is always the first semester. Let's get into college. Let's get your basic stuff out of the way, and then we'll start refining that into a major that'll allow you to do that. But I really focus instead on, you already have skills now. You have empathy. You have insight. You have the ability now to listen. And whether or not that translates into a college course or not is immaterial to the idea that take what you are good at, which is now empathy, insight, skills like that. You're a good listener. Let's use those to guide your college experience. And I think that's for me, the emphasis is kids just get, uh, they're resistant to a checklist of requirements necessary to do A, B, or C. What they like to hear is what I'm good at. And how do I take what I'm good at and translate that into something that I find it would be a good career. So that's been my approach is you can't just be another adult giving them advice about how to become a therapist. You got to be connected to them in a different way to help them understand there are things that you do well, despite the trauma, despite the adversity. You have emerged from this experience with some positive characteristics. And just the fact that you've been able to survive trauma tells me that there's something about you that inherently would allow you to translate that into getting through other hard things in life, like college, right? And so how do we kind of identify those things and push you towards those careers? And I have one, for example, and I actually began working with her when she was 17, and she was a wreck, had 2 kids already. I mean, she was struggling, and she is. I actually met with her a few days ago, and she's applied for a master's in social work program. So she's there. You know what I mean? She's
Cool.
actually been one of those that's done well, and now has seen the benefit, and is. I mean, if you knew the person, you would not recognize that person from 5 years before. That's what I'm talking about, is they see the benefit and then they are translating it into actionable behavior.
Yeah, that gave me chills too, Sarah, as I was like, that's amazing. That's the perfect example of taking your past struggles and experiences and turning them into the positive, right? And using that wisdom, like Dr. Perry mentions.
Yeah.
I love that.
And I would recommend, if there's anyone out there that's listening to get Dr. Perry's newest book, and he actually was co-authored by Oprah Winfrey, and it's actually even better on Audible, to listen to it, because it's a conversation between Dr. Perry and Oprah, and they really clearly identify that here's the impact of adversity. How do we get through that so it doesn't get in the way the rest of our lives, right? And it's a very good read, but there's so many concepts in there that even the average person would benefit from, because what he essentially has determined is we think about intervening in children's lives, youth's lives all the time. That's what we do. We're in a field where we're intervening. And he said, and I was at the very conference where he talked about this, and this was actually about 15 years ago when I first heard him say it. He said, man, we're doing this wrong. Yeah, we are doing this wrong. We are taking kids and trying to do behavior modification to help them learn the connection between behavior and consequences, when what we should be doing is helping them feel safe for the first time in their lives. We should approach them in a way that we have to calm the downstairs brain. We have to get that hypersensitive threat response under control, or they will never learn. They will never get the connection between behavior and consequences as long as they're scared and feel threatened. So he said, we've got to do a better job of helping the child feel connected with a present adult and feel safe. Now they're accessing their learning centers. That's how it works. So he's really been a very influential in the way I approach how to managing behaviors, because essentially once adversity is identified, parenting or teaching a child with that degree of diversity is not the same as your average child. It is completely counterintuitive. And that's why this field is so important. And I hope that other people will consider it, is because we need to refocus away from, oh, they're here. If we only focus on behavior, guess what? We're missing what's driving it. And we have to get to what's driving it in order to help them learn and be more successful. So anyway, that's kind of the direction I think it's taken me.
Yeah. No, that's awesome. I think that's a very important conversation and message that needs to be out there, because you're right. If you're in survival mode, you're not going to access those parts of learning and education and wanting to put your energy there, because you're just surviving day to day.
Right.
Yeah.
I feel like just listening to you talk, I mean, it's such an important field. I'm so intrigued. I feel like we could honestly just keep talking and talking and talking, but because there's so many different things, branches to talk about. I mean, our focus is obviously we have students that might be interested in this career. That story that you told about the 17-year-old gal, like, again, totally gave me chills, but it sounds like it's a good balance of an extremely challenging job, but with great rewards too.
Yeah.
You
It
see
is,
that
it
pay
is,
off, and
yeah.
it's like, okay, this is why I'm doing this.
Yeah, and it is. I call this career a system of delayed gratification. And, so it just a good example. And it was actually yesterday. I happened to be at the alternative high school, and just out of the blue, a previous student had graduated a few years ago, walked in and just wanted other teachers to know, man, I'm doing well. Look at me, I'm succeeding. I've got this great job. I've moved on, and all the predictors that sometimes those kids get about them not being successful, them having a hard life. And she was glowing in a sense. She just had that confidence, self-assurance, and she was so proud of herself for having moved away from so much adversity into an area where she just felt her life was in a great direction. That's what we do this for. And it was great. And that's the reward. I hadn't seen this person for 3 years. And all of a sudden, here she is. And what a great person, and doing well. There's your reward. Because sometimes there are days after hearing so much adversity and thinking about all the things that kids have to face and confront on a daily basis, are we making a difference? I can tell you we are. I know we are. And the general philosophy has always been, I don't know which kids are going to succeed or fail in advance. I have no idea. When a youth or even adult comes into my office or sits with me in a session, I have no idea. But I have focused my energy on making sure that the one in front of me is the one that will succeed. And I approach everyone as though they're the ones that are going to make it. Because we can't pick and choose, and we can't predict. We have to treat them all as though there are success stories. And that's the approach, I think, that's kind of made it easier for me not to personalize some of the stuff that it would be easy to personalize and avoid the outcomes of that secondary trauma that I talked about earlier. So that's an important part of it as well.
Yeah, that's awesome. I love that, because they're not just a number. Not everybody's going to learn the same way. Not everybody's going to have the same background. And so you do have to foster that connection and that safe space for them by paying attention to their specific needs and helping them understand, hey, I'm your advocate. I'm here to be your cheerleader, and I'm here to be that, safe person who can, hold that space for you to help with the basic needs to then get them to that next level of learning and growth and ultimately success, which is awesome. So,
Yeah.
and you kind of just to kind of wrap up here, because we don't want to take up too much of your time today, but like Sarah said, we could probably talk about this for like 3 hours.
And I guess we could always do a part 2 down the road.
There you go.
I'm happy to do it.
Yeah, we probably will. We definitely probably will, because this is a great conversation. But yeah, you had kind of touched on this earlier. But if you could go back in time and kind of give yourself advice, what advice would you give to yourself in high school?
Take it more seriously. I mean, ultimately, it's tough. You're an adolescent. You're very impulsive. In my case, I wanted to have a lot of fun, and that didn't always translate to sitting in a classroom or paying attention like I should. And I think if we could just take that part of our lives a little more seriously, as difficult as that is, that would certainly be helpful for all of us, whether there's adversity or not. So that's, I think, the best way I could put it is look at it differently as your opportunity to build a solid foundation on which everything that comes after will rest.
Yeah, awesome. And then, just to touch back on the, you mentioned the importance of self-care as a big way for you to kind of compartmentalize with your clients, as well as seeing them as the success story, that this is the person that's going to succeed. And so within those kind of areas of, self-care and redirecting and compartmentalizing, what are some of the things that you do for self-care, and what do you like to do outside of work?
Well, for those who know me, know I'm a mountain biker first and foremost. So I'll do that as often as I can and as much as I can to try to maintain just that general physical health, but that relates directly to one's mental health as well. And it's interesting because I promote that self-care concept to a lot of patients who are struggling. And I really emphasize this idea that I'm never going to be willing to ask a client to do something I wouldn't be willing to do myself. If I say you need to improve self-care and here's some of the things you can do to implement that, well, I better be willing to demonstrate that I can do that. And so that's been part of it. That's what motivates me, is I've got to be able to sit across from a client and help them really understand the benefit of that. So that's important. And so I stay active in the summer and the winter. Snowboarding is a replacement for mountain biking, if you will. And skiing and whatever. I'll do it just to stay busy and to stay active. And a part of that, and this is again related to the research. I don't want to get too deep into that because I know our time's about up, but research around depression, anxiety, and so many other mental health issues tells us if you're not interested in medicating yourself or to try to feel better, that movement is going to be the key. That means get off the couch, move, whether it's walking, whether that's dancing, whether that's riding a bike, whether it's just taking a walk around the house. Do movement and keep moving, because that's part of the healing process, particularly if we're struggling. And so, just simple things. It's not complicated. I think we tend to complicate the treatment of mental illness as though it has to be some magic bullet that solves somebody's problems, when it's a series of small, simple things that a person can implement over time that makes the big difference. And so it's simple. Take a walk, go on a bike ride, do something to move your body every day, and do it consistently and without fail. And that's going to help you feel better. So if I'm talking to clients about that, I better be doing it myself, right?
Yeah, I love that. Lead by example, right?
You don't do those like crazy ridgeline extreme mountain biking trails, do you? Like the Red Rock stuff?
The red line in Arizona.
Oh, I see those YouTube videos, and I'm like, my heart's just coming out of my chest watching it.
Well, I have a few trails where it's similar to that, and it is a little bit threat, but when you're on the bike, it doesn't register that this is potentially dangerous. but I have some of those spins that I ride, and you're going down pretty fast, and it just never occurs to me, well, what happens if I wreck, or I know it's going to hurt. I do know that part, but I don't think about it in the moment. And the funny thing about that is, when you're on a bike, it doesn't seem like what it's like when you watch it on YouTube. It's just the weirdest kind. When you look at it on YouTube, it feels like, wow, that just is intense and scary, and it looks worse than I think it really is. When you're on the bike and you're there, it just feels like this is what I'm supposed to be doing.
There you go. I'm
not going to do Red Rock in Sedona, Arizona. They call it the White Line, and it's just the craziest thing. If you ever want to look up something crazy, look up the White Line in Sedona, Arizona, and that'll freak you out, because
one of our students brought that up like a month ago, one of our students was like, have you ever heard of this white line? And I never heard of it. And actually, like, it was maybe a month ago, he brought it up in one of our mentor calls. And I was like, I'm going to check this out. And that's the exact one I was thinking of. That's insanity.
Yeah, that's too much for me. So,
Awesome. Well, thank you for your time today, Les.
bet.
We really appreciate the insights, and yeah, we might be reaching out to you for a part 2 because I feel like
yeah, happy to do it. Just
So
let me know.
awesome. Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody.